Dr. Seuss's book, The Lorax, has a lot in common with the biblical prophets. And what I mean by that is that they share the same dual structure in their message. And that structure looks like this. First, there's a harsh judgment that they both have. That judgment says that if you do not meet the needs of the poor, of the vulnerable, and of the marginalized of society, your society is going to die. But within that judgment is also a message of hope. Hope that if you do meet the needs of the poor, of the vulnerable, and of the marginalized of your society, that you will thrive. Now, where do we see this in the biblical prophets? I think the greatest example of this is Amos. Amos lived in Israel during a time when there was a great disparity between the rich and the poor. And for Amos, the problem was not so much that the rich were rich, but that the rich neglected the needs of the poor. And so Amos spoke for those who were basically voiceless in society, for the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. And he told the rich that if they continue to remain in their houses and sit on their ivory beds and eat the greatest food and drink the finest wine and ignore the needs of the poor, that their society is going to die. And indeed, that's what ended up happening as the Assyrian Empire conquered the nation of Israel. And Amos said this was due because they neglected the needs of the poor and the vulnerable of society. Now, where do we see this within the Lorax? It starts off in this kind of post-apocalyptic world, and so already you're seeing some kind of judgment that will emerge. And you are one of the main characters in the book, and you go out in search of the story, and you find the Onceler. And the Onceler knows the story, and he tells you about how he came to the town one day and saw these beautiful truffula trees. And he saw that the truffula trees were great for making thneeds. Well, what's a thneed? The Onceler tells us that a thneed's a fine something that all people need. It's a shirt, it's a sock, it's a glove, it's a hat, but it has other uses, yes, far beyond that. You can use it for carpets, for pillows, for sheets, or curtains, or covers, or bicycle seats. And as more and more people buy these thneeds, you get the sense that nobody is really concerned about the environmental cost that these thneeds are having on their world. But the Lorax does see it, and he tries to do something about it. So he confronts the Onceler and says, look at all of these truffula trees that you're cutting down. Soon there will be no more truffula trees. Look at the pollution that your factories are creating. Here we see that the Lorax speaks for those who don't have a voice, for the truffula trees and for the environment, and says you are destroying our environment and the truffula trees in order to make these thneeds. Soon there will be nothing left. And as we get to the end of the book, we see that indeed there is nothing left in this town. But as the Onceler ends the story, he gives you the last truffula seed. And he says that it's now up to you, and unless you do something about this, nothing is going to change. And this is the message of judgment and of hope that Dr. Seuss is giving us in the Lorax. And it makes me wonder, what are our thneeds today? And I think that our greatest thneed is probably electronics. Everybody wants an iPad or a tablet, an iPhone or an Android. But I wonder, what is the cost, the human cost and the environmental cost? It has been brought to our attention recently that as these electronic companies are making record profits, the workers in these Chinese factories are getting paid below a living wage, are often forced to work overtime, and forced to stand for nearly 12 hours a day as they create these products for us. And I wonder, are we going to be a voice for them? Apple and other companies like HP have said that there are problems in these factories, and they have promised to do something about them. But as one Apple executive told the New York Times recently, that the power really remains in the consumers. And unless consumers do something about this, unless consumers tell Apple that they demand a change, Apple's not really going to make changes. So I think that here is the judgment that these electronic companies are even giving to themselves. But it could be that they aren't actually going to change unless we, the consumers, do something about it. And so I think that the seed of hope lies within us. Dr. Seuss and the prophets and even Apple executives are telling us, unless we do something about this, nothing is going to change. So what are we going to do? Are we going to care? Are we going to demand that working conditions improve in China? Because if Dr. Seuss and the prophets are right, it's our responsibility to alleviate the human and the environmental suffering in the world. And in the words of the Lorax, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not.